Thank you so much. I'm really honored. This is the latest I've ever spoken. I have little children, so I'm usually asleep by this time, so thank you so much. A special thank you to Theo, who facilitated, and Jan, who helped me deal with all the logistics of this evening, so thank you. So let me start this talk today by telling you a story about my dad and a boy in a kippah. One summer afternoon in 2005, my father and I walked down Odesa's Park Shevchenko and came across a group of children from the nearby Jewish kindergarten. And my father, who grew up in the Soviet Union, looked amazed. He said, "I know we're in Odessa, a city commonly recognized as a Jewish place, but I can't believe these children are walking around openly in the park in their kippahs." So we sit down and chat for a bit. One of the boys comes up to me. He recognized me from one of my earlier visits. He looked towards my dad and said, "Is your dad Jewish?" And I said, "He is." So he put his little finger to my dad's head and said, "Well, why isn't he wearing a kippah?" You know, my father thought he was pretty Jewish up until that point. Growing up in the Soviet Union, he had never doubted his Jewishness. If anything, there was no way to escape it. Nor has his Jewishness ever been challenged, especially by a 5-year-old child on the basis of religion. So I tell you this story because it speaks to the profound changes Odessa has undergone since the fall of the Soviet Union, which I will discuss today. In that encounter between my father and the 5-year-old child, we clearly see that post-Soviet Odessa is a place where multiple orientations of Jewishness converge. Something that has been the focus of my work for a long time. For nearly 2 decades, I have been looking at how Jewish life in Odessa has evolved. This book here, which I have jokingly called my 6th child, defines half of my life. But the topic of Jewish identity and questions of how Soviet Jewishness survived and evolved from state secularism is a question that interests me long before I became an anthropologist. I was born in the Soviet Union and raised in a secular Jewish family with 2 grandparents from Ukraine, one from Belarus and one from Lithuania. My Jewishness was defined publicly by my name and the 5th line in my passport. And privately, the 5th line in my passport that said Jewish. And privately by Jewish food served on days that loosely marked the Jewish calendar, and stories of family migration, reading Jewish authors, listening to Jewish music, and experiencing a deep sense of pride and any sense of Jewish achievement. When I was 9, I moved to the United States when I first stepped foot into a synagogue and observed people in prayer. As a child who grew up in a country void of religion, I was deeply interested in how religion entered into the lives of those Jews who remained in the country that once made up their USSR. I always wanted to know what happened to the people who stayed and how their lives were shaped by the new opportunities for Jewish expression, specifically religion. This book was born out of my passion for learning about this new era of Jewish life. I wanted to know what happens to Jewish people and their identity when withering structures of socialism give way to globalism and streams of religion, cultural, and national revivals. This book is very much a continuation of that early curiosity. It is the first ethnography of its kind. While historical scholarly work has paved the way for our understanding of Odessa's past, very little has been written about Jewish life in Odessa since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This book provides a human-centered, contemporary lens to understanding the daily experiences of Jews in the 21st century, giving us a nuanced understanding of a city that has profoundly shaped the Jewish population. I often get asked, why Odessa? I chose Odessa, as Theo pointed out, for its incredible, beautiful history and the myth around that history. But also in that sense of uniqueness the city always had to think of itself as a state within a state. So in today's talk, I want to take you along on my anthropological journey told through the eyes of Jewish Odessans. I want to first discuss how I conducted fieldwork and how I earned their trust. Then I'm going to dive into some of the main ideas of the research, mainly, I can't talk about everything, contested history, migration, and revival. And finally, I will end with a discussion of how my research fits into the contemporary political climate today. My research raises critical questions about ideas of a Jewish home and belonging through the lived experience of Jewish Odessans as they weathered those transformations from the time of the Orange Revolution to the brink of the full-scale invasion. When I started my project, I was well aware of Odessa's historical claim to being a Jewish city, and I wanted to know what defined its Jewishness today. How was the Jewish identity of people and places negotiated and redefined in diverse contexts? What actors and events defined the complex interplay between local and global traditions in Odessa? And how has the war further affected this process of transformation? My goal is that by the end of the talk, I would have shed some light on these questions and yielded a deeper understanding of Jewish life in contemporary Ukraine. Throughout the centuries, Odessa has been a glorious pearl perched on the edge of the Black Sea. The city was founded by Catherine II in 1794 in her expansion of the Russian Empire, an area known as Novorossiya. And you would have heard this term used in Putin's propaganda as an area that he claims is New Russia that belongs to him. It was built on the former Ottoman territory, a port called Kajibey, and as it rose from a tiny village into a commercial metropolis and later a free trade port of international significance, it earned a reputation as the region's El Dorado, where Jews, among other early settlers, came to escape the reins of small-town life, shtetls. And indeed, many had the opportunity to integrate into society. Settlers from all nationalities went to the blooming city to seek their fortunes. Odessa's rapid growth in the 19th century placed it among the fastest-growing cities comparable to Chicago and San Francisco. Jews constituted the second largest group of immigrants. At the dawn of the 20th century, Jews constituted more than 30% of the city's population, forming an integral part of its economy and society. Overall, the city's multi-ethnic population, its position far from the metropole and a multilinguistic layer, gave it a feeling of a special, singular place, a place apart. As a Jewish place, it had a reputation for being non-traditional, progressive, and what John Clear called an anti-shtetl. As he wrote, the most un-Jewish city from a traditional point of view, and the most Jewish from the perspective of non-traditional Jewish life and attitudes. The city has often been described as the cradle of modern Jewish literature, where the sages of Odessa, Leon Pinsker, Moses Liljenblum, Achad Chaim, Mendel Mohem Sorim, Chaim Nachman Bialik, and others lived and contributed to the intellectual debates about the future of Jewish culture. Odessa has been coined as a musical city of the empire, a birthplace of Zionism, and a breeding ground of progressive Judaism and Jewish modernization movements, Haskalah, including Haskalah. A city made famous by Isaac Babel's Odessa stories and other literary creations, becoming an integral part of the Odessa myth. In the Soviet period, Odessan humor made it a place recognizable among all Soviet subjects. The Jews of Odessa have historically experienced periods of social and economic thriving, but also dark stretches of history visible through hostility, pogroms, Romanian occupation, and the Holocaust, topics which are sadly too large for me to cover today. Even after the disintegration of the Soviet Union and significant Jewish immigration from the region, where over half of the Jewish population left the city, the remaining population was deeply involved in the process of Jewish revival, which I focus on my research. When I arrived in the city nearly 2 decades ago, I was immediately struck by the passion locals had for their city, which they lovingly called Odessa Mama. Walking me through their courtyards, chestnut-lined streets, city parks, food markets, favorite cafes tucked inside European-style buildings, they would weave stories of their own families and of Odessa's impressive Jewish and world heritage. In each conversation, Odessa represented a uniquely cosmopolitan and specifically Jewish space. These intimate conversations were small doorways into complex systems of meanings, values, ideologies, identities, and life strategies that I try to make sense of in this book. And here you have some photographs of walking tours that officially take place, but also just walks around the city that I did with families, showing you this is the Odessa port, and this is one of the oldest synagogues, which was a butcher's synagogue. So in Odessa, synagogues were subdivided by profession. This now functions as Jewish Cultural Center, Migdal. Walking through the city with my interlocutors proved to be one of the most enriching ways of getting to see their Odessa and earning their trust, understanding their particular relations to the city's past and present. When I became really good at bargaining at the famous Privoz market, where Odessans flocked to buy the best produce, my friends called me Ariela Desitka. I lived in Odessa from 2005 to 2007 and returned to field work in 2014 and 2019. During this time, I was affiliated with the Odessa National University in the Sociology Department, working with Professor Emma Gontsova, who facilitated some of my earliest introductions to the city's Jewish community through students in her department and her own daughter, who worked as an educator in the Jewish nursery. Through these initial introductions, I met Jewish Odessans of different generations with whom I conducted semi-structured interviews and engaged in ordinary discussions. More formal engagements with the city's academics, intellectuals, and leaders of various Jewish organizations gave me another layer into Odessa's Jewish development. Throughout the initial 2 years, I also collected life histories of elderly Jews and participated in their daily routine. A highly cherished experience, mostly because none of them are alive here anymore. I volunteered at the local Jewish Community Center in Migdal, where I taught English. I translated materials and participated in classes, celebrations, and various events organized around the Jewish calendar. I regularly spent Shabbats with religious families who kindly invited me to their homes for Friday night dinners and Saturday lunches, and attended a variety of ceremonies and life cycle rituals, and Odessa's different congregations. My methods of gathering information varied depending on situations and on individuals. Most of my data was collected in Russian, which served as the primary language of communication at that time. But many Odessans spoke Ukrainian fluently through means of education as well. Some chose to speak English to practice their language skills. And at that point, I didn't encounter any Ukrainian language Jewish activity, but Ukrainian was used in public displays and Jewish memorials all over the city as well. Most of my interlocutors were educated cultural individuals who could reflect on their own experiences in history and in current events and provided a high level of analysis. I've tried not to speak for them, but rather to give their stories, a prominence to their stories. When I arrived in the city in 2005, interested to know how Jewish identities and places changed in the aftermath of the Soviet Union and how individuals redefined their sense of being Jewish in an ever-evolving Ukraine, Odessa has been transformed. In the Soviet Union, Jewish was a nationality, as I mentioned. Now, new markers defined what it meant to be Jewish, and religion has taken a prominent role in this process. But older, socially embedded understandings also didn't disappear overnight either. And here you see a picture of Hanukkah put up for the holiday of Hanukkah next to Duc de Richelieu, who was the first governor of Odessa in 1803. And behind there is, used to be Catherine the Great Square. Actually, when I first arrived in the city, I'll just show you this picture, it had a monument of Potemkin. And then from 2007, it had a monument of Catherine, which has now been replaced, and now there's a Ukrainian flag in its place. So.
Sorry, you mean a monument to the battleship Potemkin?
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. When the manuscript was complete, these processes of change and negotiation of identities and traditions embedded in cultural religious transformations proved central to my fieldwork. Little did I know that the negotiations would also be central in writing and publishing this book 2 decades later. When the manuscript was complete, the final decision about the title and cover of the book was still in motion. At the time of my initial research, as I mentioned, the Jewish population, like the city as a whole, were predominantly Russian-speaking, and Jews I met did not regard themselves as Ukrainian Jews, but rather as Jews living in Ukraine, or simply as Odessans, some still referring to themselves as Soviet Jews. Many of the elderly had strong connections to the larger world of ex-Soviet Jewry as a result of migration, and they would say things like, "Я советский человек, I'm a Soviet person." The younger generation were more closely connected to Ukraine, but still highly influenced by the rhetoric of their family circles. Throughout the project, my working title has been Negotiating Traditions, Jewish Life in Post-Soviet Odessa. By the time I was finished writing the book, Ukraine and the world had been greatly transformed. Generally, there was a question of how long something stays post-anything. And to call Ukraine post-Soviet was, some suggested, to confine it to a historical framework that no longer applied. More specifically, a colonial critique saw the term post-Soviet to be a sign of a naturalized Russian colonization, a hangover of an accepted Russian hegemony, and one that continued to center the narrative of the core and all historical accounts of the periphery. And here you say you have Jewish street written in Russian and Ukrainian next to each other. So I decided to change the title, bringing Odessa into the focus and connecting it to contemporary Ukraine. You know how they say don't judge a book by its cover? Well, this cover is getting judged. When I sent an early mock-up to a friend, she said at once, Jewish Odessa with one S? What a provocative title for those in the know. And I all of a sudden thought, what's provocative about it? Is it the fact that it's too Jewish? Did I overlook the fact that it's Greek, Russian, Ukrainian, and many other things? Is it the fact that there's very little Jews left and therefore we can't call it Jewish anymore? All these thoughts went into my head. And she said, no. Actually, in removing the second S, you are deviating from the mother tongue of many of your interlocutors and making a definite statement that Odessa is now Ukraine. Now, for those not in the know, Odessa with two S's is the traditional and prolific Russian spelling. Odessa with one S is the Ukrainian spelling. And while it is the city's official name, it stands out as a statement, a decided break from the commonplace. Now, for many of my interlocutors, their own adaptation of Odessa felt awkward, but appropriate in the context of today. Now, employing the Ukrainian spelling on an urban level should not suggest that Russian spelling has disappeared from the landscape of the city, even in times of war. And here you see a banner that says Odessa, Ukraina, and written in Russian by the Opera House, with sandbags all around to protect it. And this tension is sometimes that we're seeing, is something that we're seeing in different ways around the city. I worked closely with the Jewish Museum in helping them change their labels from Russian to Ukrainian and to English. And this was not an easy process, not because of the logistics involved, but because of the emotions. So a guide I called Tanya says, it's easy to change the sign, but it's hard to change the story. No one knows how the war will affect the narratives of Jewish life, but I do know that the stories that we used to tell will change. We used to speak about Catherine the Great as a person responsible for facilitating Jewish migration to the region. Today, Catherine is a non grata, taboo. I don't even know if we'll be able to use the term Russian Empire, because it's almost like a curse word now. Tanya explained that guides of historical Odessa and Jewish Odessa carefully navigate their new reality, watching their every word and reflecting on old terminology. Officially, all tours must be conducted in Ukrainian, and we can't have any memorabilia of Soviet and Imperial Russia. But if we got rid of all Soviet and Russian relics, we would be left with no history. This entails a complete redressing of the stage, and this is Tatiana speaking. When I asked her what language she leads the tours in, she says, honestly, I still lead the tours in Russian. She pauses to correct herself. No, rather, I start the tours with a few words in Ukrainian. I'll tell the visitors that I'll switch to between Russian and Ukrainian. Well, not really Russian, but Odessan. Так будет вкуснее, she says. It'll be tastier that way. She jokes around. Now, while national legislation mandates the use of Ukrainian because the local Jewish museum is not a state museum or under city municipalities, they basically make their own rules. I always pay attention to my audience, Tanya says. When I'm with Ukrainian speakers, I try to use more Ukrainian. If I'm with Odessans and comfortable in both languages, I use my Odessan chopped salad, she said, laughing. The two spellings and more languages used and identities that they signal coexist in an overlap that is sometimes harmonious and sometimes in dramatic tension. These cultural entanglements have defined Odessa historically and continue to do so today, when diverse linguistic and cultural elements have taken their shape in yet another new chapter of the city's history. The question of when to use Russian or Ukrainian language reflects a whole host of questions that my interlocutors have long asked themselves and others about identity. What is it to be Odessan? To be Jewish Odessan, or more recently in the context of the war, what is it to be a Ukrainian Jew? It was through these questions and the varied evolving answers elicited that the Jewish individuals and communities I portray have negotiated and recast their sense of self and worked to develop a meaningful sense of togetherness as a community. These struggles for identity have played out in the forms of migration as well. As people used to say, Jewish is a mode of transportation. Immigration has always been a key component of Jewish life in the region, driven by external pressures and personal economic motivations. Jews emigrated from Odessa en masse after the breakup of the Soviet Union, but some have also returned to the city. When I initially started my fieldwork, I was immensely intrigued by the returnees, curious to know how did they see the city differently upon their return. Did it still constitute a unique and special home? Did it still function as a crucial hub in a larger cosmopolitan Jewish world? And what did they make of the places they left behind, mostly Israel? My focus in the book and an experience of these returnees and transmigrants show another rich dimension of our understanding of the various identities and communities that develop by transversing the space between home and diaspora. The project was initially structured around return migration and questions of home and belonging. But these persistences of larger processes of negotiating traditions and identities and traditions were much more reflective of what I witnessed in the everyday life of people I met. And so I followed these visible transformations on an individual, familial, communal, and urban level through my engagement with different groups in Odessa. As a result of migration, Odessa was home to many different communities and congregations ranging from Orthodox to Reform, competing for recognition and authenticity in Odessa's Jewish space. Their work and its effect and reception form another major theme of the work. You know the old Jewish joke, how many synagogues does a Jew need? 3, one that's his, one that's not his, and one that they'll never go to? So this was exactly the scene in Odessa. Chabad and Litvak Orthodox communities were the largest congregations in the city, each with over 1,000 congregants and around 5,000 online followers. They each had a line of Jewish schools, a Jewish university, a Jewish orphanage, and their own kosher restaurants, shops, and mikveh, and a range of Jewish programs for the elderly and the young. Despite the fact that the two rabbis are actually distant cousins, both claimed the status of chief rabbi of Odessa, and only agreed on one thing, which is their lack of recognition for the female rabbi of the Reform community in the city. I think I was the only person who visited everybody and engaged with congregants from everywhere and anywhere, but obviously had to make difficult decisions where I would welcome Shabbat and celebrate different celebrations. Although Odessa at the beginning of the 20th century had around 70 prayer houses, there was just one synagogue in Soviet Odessa. In Odessa, I knew Jewish life in the city was indeed more pronounced. Synagogue, kosher restaurants, public events, the lighting of the Hanukkah, which you saw earlier, public celebrations and rituals and religious festivals. But to some Soviet-born and raised Odessans, their strictly Jewish agenda separated Jews from others and altered the city's urbanity. And I remember discussing this with Alex, a 60-year-old tall, slender man with a full head of white hair. And he said to me, in my days, I used to run a math club. And many children were Jewish, but no one cared who came from where and who they were. They were just interested in math. Now kids in Jewish schools have less exposure to non-Jewish children. And Odessan youth lose contact with Jewish peers, he concluded, with a sense of nostalgia. Now, while Alex had a more romanticized memory of the Soviet Brotherhood of Nations model of life where religion did not play a role, many of the foreign Jewish activists, however, saw their work as reinstating forgotten and forbidden elements of Jewish practices. Scholars of ex-Soviet Jewry have widely noted the problematics of Jewish revival driven by foreign leadership. My work also documents the various ways the presence of organized Jewish life offered many Jews in Odessa, especially the young generations, new pathways for considering their identification. And here you have one of the main synagogues, and this is a festival of Jewish diaspora and klezmer music and part of the display in the Jewish Museum in Odessa. At the same time, I also problematized the term revival used to widely document Jewish activity. In this book, I illustrated those who have taken up observance rarely described their journeys as returning to traditions, that they had previously been abandoned by the elders. Instead, the newly observed Jews were adopting customs that weren't familiar nor approved by their parents or grandparents. Not surprisingly, in some cases, secular family members repudiated these new religious practices as backwards, articulating the residual force of Soviet modernization narrative. But many saw themselves as pioneers, even if for some the attachment to religion were partial, indefinite, interrupted, or even abandoned altogether. And I remember vividly visiting my friend Igor's grandmother. Igor had become observant in the early 2000s, and he walked around in a kippah and tzitzit around the city. Upon entering into his grandmother's small one-bedroom apartment, Igor's grandmother instantly pointed to his head and said, "Why are you walking around like that? Must you tell everybody that you're Jewish?" And he looked at her and said, "Well, that's exactly the point." So dissatisfied with his response, she went on to drill him further and said, "When are you getting married?" And he said, "I'm waiting to meet a nice Jewish girl." And again, extremely dissatisfied with his answer, she said, "In my days, we married somebody because they were a decent person, an educated person, a kind person. To marry somebody just because they're Jewish, it's silly. It's nonsense." So here, you see through the encounter a complete shift in value systems which Igor had adopted without his family's support. Older Jews in Odessa had come of age in a much different world of possibilities, for migration, for religious practice, and a sense of national belonging. They told me stories that capture multiple shifts in family practices, identity, and social orientations from pre-revolutionary times to today, and their reaction to the development of Jewish organizational life. They had lived through the Soviet era when Jewish merely served as a broadly defined ethnicity. Each had their unique experience of living as Jews in Soviet Odessa and feeding the ways of post-Soviet migration onto their home. Elie Wiesel's famous book, Jews of Silence, painted a grim picture of Jewish life in the Soviet Union. Other scholars have described Jewish identity as a hollow and emptied-out vessel. But I found Jews in Odessa were deeply attached to their Jewishness despite the Soviet policy's discrimination in 70 years of state socialism. Their combined narrative showed that Jews remained connected to their Jewish roots despite changing their names or joining the Communist Party. At the same time, they didn't just accept new models or modes of being Jewish offered through the post-Soviet reforms, or necessarily viewed them as modernizing. Some participated in Jewish cultural events, but treated religious aspects of Odessa with skepticism. Others did not find a way to connect to the new rubric of Jewishness or recognize its roots in the city. One couple that always touched my heart were 87-year-old Olga, who worked as a librarian until the last days of her life, and her husband Victor, who was 92. Throughout my time in the city, I visited them regularly throughout my time in the city, in their one-room apartment overburdened by stacks of books and old newspapers. Sitting around their three-chair table in the kitchen, we often discussed Odessa's history. In one conversation, Olga told me, "I distrust the rabbis. They're trying to turn Odessa into something that it's not, Orthodox." Odessa's Jewishness had also become a destination and a point of interest for Jews from around the world supporting Jewish communities in need. In this book, I also trace what happens when various groups of travelers pass through the city to witness Jewish heritage, while they as individuals connect to their own roots and Jewish values of tzedakah and tikkun olam, repairing the world. These cultural displays are often theatrical and draw in a large number of participants who entertain philanthropy missions that descend upon Odessa. These interactions, or asymmetrical encounters as I call them, raise varied emotions from the local population. And here you see an image of American philanthropist coming to the Jewish Cultural Center and taking pictures of some kids and some youths dressed in fiddler Naru type dress and very kind of traditional Ukrainian outfits. Now, while these visits at times ignite a lot of excitement, there were also a sense of disappointment that Jews from around the world couldn't engage with their sense of pride for living in Odessa. And there were a lot of conversations as to, why didn't you leave, and why, they were sort of seen, especially when we would go to see elderly people's homes, that they were introduced as kind of the relatives that didn't make the boat to America. And so there was a lot of sentiment that people didn't see and recognize their sense of pride of staying in Odessa, of living in Odessa, of actually continuing their lives as Jews in Ukraine. Instead, some described being frozen in Soviet time, where visitors came to look at them as Jews in a third world country. I seek to show that in these moments how Jewishness can be remade and reshaped, cultivated from within, while instilled from without. But of course, we can't talk about any change and transformation without acknowledging the Euromaidan events of 2014, which shook the whole nation and transformed Ukraine's image around the world. When I arrived in the city after Russian annexation of Crimea, many of the younger Jewish Odessans I knew were focused on Ukrainian politics and had become active in Euromaidan protests, with some volunteering for city defense leagues. And here you have some pictures of manifestations and the fire that took place on 2nd of May in Odessa. I still remember my shock when I ran into Misha at a pro-Ukrainian protest outside. I knew him a religiously observant man, a rather timid man for many years. Now he was wearing a bulletproof vest and showing me his pistol. I'm not a patriot of Ukraine, he told me, but if some filth wants to enter into my city, I will fight until the end. And these themes came up with many religious Jews who I knew who were willing to take up arms to defend their city. And they indeed became patriots of Ukraine. During these periods, it was clear that previous bonds to the Russian and Soviet world in language and culture were radically weakened. For some, speaking and writing in Russian became interpreted as a political statement and a lack of Ukrainian loyalty. Among my friends and colleagues and interlocutors, people continued to speak to one another in Russian, which was still the language in the streets and the homes that I visited. But the content of conversations changed as political topics started to rise more and more. And many did start to speak Ukrainian more, and some switched to Ukrainian. In my correspondence with members of the Odessa intelligentsia, I heard Odessa cast more frequently as part of Ukraine, and themselves as essentially Ukrainian, even as they separated Russian politics from Russian people at that earlier stage. Some supported personal and professional ties across the Russian border. Others lost family, friends, and colleagues on the basis of differing views. And yet to some people I spoke to, the war seemed far from Odessa at that time. In other words, some felt Euromaidan directly, others were still disconnected from military action to the east, although the loss of Crimea was marked by all. I still remember February 24th, 2022 as a surreal horror film, when I woke up to bombs falling in Odessa and tanks rolling in across the Ukrainian border. Just the night before, I spoke to my friend Dina, who suspected that it was all just a bunch of noise. There's a lot of talk about it, but I can't imagine Russia invading, as she said. I'll see you next month. It happened. The Russia's full-scale invasion, which brought war to many regions beyond Donbass, changed that sense of distance and greatly intensified trends of identity formation. In short, it bolstered a sense of being Ukrainian. Under siege, Ukraine became home for those who had long seen their lives as part of a wider Russian milieu. As Tatiana Zhuzhenko explains, Russian aggression has done what previous Ukrainian presidents failed to do, catalyze the creation of a political nation. In this war, one of my interlocutors explained, they're killing us because we are Ukrainian. This rapid acceleration towards Ukrainian identity meant, for many, a necessary separation from the older and established identification with Russia, a withdrawal from what has long been a shared social world. These personal and public transformations continue to be shaped and reshaped by the realities of war. It was in this context that I attempted to bring the book to a close, while at the same time helping many people I knew from Odessa to cross borders in search of a safer home. With time, I continued my research, working with Ukrainian Jewish refugees who arrived in Germany, Romania, Spain, and elsewhere in Europe. Some still there, others eventually returned. While Jewish communal life in Ukraine has been greatly reduced, the remaining Jewish organizations claim an increase in numbers of new participants and a growing interest in Jewish community programs, in part due to internally displaced families who arrived in the city and others seeking support. And here you have some pictures of various activities, some support groups that have been formed by women, prayer groups, just social activity for families, and Shabbat celebrations. Jewish organizations have become hubs of humanitarian aid, offering material, moral, psychological support for the remaining Jewish population and beyond. At the same time, Ukrainian Jewish relations have become more publicly visible, celebrated at the national level. On both political and civil level, Jews have never seemed so well integrated into the Ukrainian state. And here you have a picture of the first Jewish chaplain who works. There's now 2 and more people being trained to work in the Ukrainian military. And here you have Zelensky welcoming Chabad rabbis for Rosh Hashanah celebration. And this is streamed on national television, so these programs are viewed by the public. Meanwhile, new Jewish initiatives like the first Haggadah, the story of the Jewish exodus from Egypt, read over Passover, was printed in Ukrainian, a sign of a new chapter of Ukrainian Jewish heritage shaped by war. I've just finished writing an article about 3 Ukrainian language Haggadahs in a journal called Jewish Renaissance in the UK, which will come out for Passover. And this one is called For Our Freedom, produced by an organization called Kersher Ukraine, which is an all-women's organization. And obviously you see very visible pictures of the war, and you see Jews sitting around the table, some wearing vyshyvanka, a very traditional Ukrainian dress, and a girl wearing a t-shirt with a trizub, Ukrainian national symbol. And this culmination of Jewishness and Ukrainianness in this one picture, which are both fighting for their freedom.
Pretty building.
Yeah. Lost track. Printed in Ukrainian here signals a new chapter of Ukrainian Jewish heritage shaped by war. Some commentators have called this a golden era of Ukrainian relations, while the others worry what comes after the war and how to address the past remains a big question. But among all the uncertainty and trauma of everyday war, Jewish Odessans have also displayed immense resilience, not least through humor. I don't know if you can read this. This is a t-shirt made by 2 Jewish Odessans, say Shalom is Ukraini, which became incredibly popular among refugees who wanted to both signal their kind of Jewishness and Ukrainianness wherever they were. And this is a picture put on Facebook by 4 religious men saying an ordinary Monday of Ukrainian neo-Nazis in Odessa, obviously picking up on Putin's propaganda and defying it by this imagery to say that Jews are not only living and publicly practicing their religion in Ukraine, but it is in Ukraine where they feel at home. So some dark humor is there. Now, Azelia Kaminsky, an Odessa poet, recently wrote in an essay, Americans love to portray Ukraine as a place of doom, but people still go to restaurants, celebrate birthdays, and take care of children. We need to honor that. These are real people with real memories, temperaments, and stories, not perfect victims as the West portrays them. There have been many ends to old Odessa, but the city and its people provide multiple examples of how different people can live and thrive together, and most importantly, how they can heal from social and political upheavals and wars. Odessa has always been an eclectic mix of people, cultures, languages, and different understandings about what it means to be Odessan. I hope this research can provide guidance for understanding a crucial period in the city's history and offer a pathway to peace in the future.